For the last 2 years, my house has been silent. It's a deep, polished kind of silence, the kind that settles over furniture that's never out of place and floors that are always clean. I keep it that way. A perfect, pristine mausoleum for a perfect, pristine life that ended far too soon. On the mantelpiece, a photo of Mark and me on our 15th anniversary sits in a silver frame, untouched by dust. His arm is around me, his smile so wide and genuine it still steals my breath. We were happy, we were perfect. The only sound that ever breaks the quiet is the key in the front door, always at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Anna, honey?" "I'm here!" My sister Chloe breezed in, carrying 2 paper grocery bags and a gust of the outside world with her. She set the bags on the granite countertop with a cheerful thud. "I got that new coffee you like and some fresh bread from the bakery. You need to eat something other than sad widow cereal." She smiled at me, a gentle, pitying smile I'd grown used to. For 2 years, she has been my rock, my everything. When Mark's sailboat was found, splintered and empty, 20 miles off the coast, Chloe was the one who held me together on the beach while the Coast Guard gave us the grim news. She was the one who planned the memorial, who dealt with the lawyers, who helped me navigate the suffocating fog of grief. "Chloe, you don't have to do this," I said, my voice feeling rusty from disuse. "Nonsense," she chirped, already unpacking the groceries with an efficiency I could no longer muster. "Mark would want me to take care of you. You know how he adored you." She'd say that a lot. It was her favorite refrain, a comforting balm on a wound that refused to heal. She paused, pulling a thick manila envelope from her purse. "Oh, the quarterly statement for the investment account came. I went ahead and paid the property tax bill from it. Everything's looking good. We're secure," I just nodded. I hadn't looked at a single financial document since Mark died. The life insurance payout? It felt like blood money. Chloe, with her sharp mind for numbers, had taken care of all of it. She set up the accounts, paid the bills, managed everything. It was easier that way. It meant I didn't have to face the brutal reality that my life, my entire existence, was now being funded by my husband's death. It was my biggest failure, this passivity, this willingness to let her handle the hard parts, to keep my world small and quiet and safe. "Whatever you think is best, Chloe," I murmured. "I can't even look at that stuff." Her expression softened. She came over and wrapped her arms around me. Her hugs were always a little too tight, a little too possessive. "Of course, sweetie. That's what I'm here for." The day of the accident is a memory that comes in flashes, sharp and cruel like shards of glass. The metallic taste of panic when the phone rang. The Coast Guard officer's voice full of practiced sympathy. Standing on the cold, windswept beach, the salty air burning my lungs, my eyes scanning the horizon for a sail that would never appear. They found the boat's wreckage that afternoon. A jagged piece of the hull with his company logo still visible. I remember sinking to my knees in the wet sand, a sound tearing from my throat that didn't feel human. And I remember Chloe's arms, a constant grounding pressure, holding me, protecting me from a world that had just been ripped apart. She was my hero. Now standing in my silent kitchen, she squeezed my shoulder one last time before grabbing her purse. "Okay, I have to run. Big meeting. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all." And just like that, she was gone. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. It was in these moments, in the suffocating quiet of the evening, that the loneliness was most acute. It was an active presence, a ghost that sat beside me on the couch. I knew I couldn't face another night alone with just my memories. So I ordered Thai food and settled onto the sofa, my phone in hand, ready to lose myself in the endless, meaningless scroll of the internet. The pad thai was cold. I'd been picking at it for the better part of an hour, the sweet and savory noodles congealing in their white carton on my coffee table. On the television, some reality show I wasn't really watching filled the silence with manufactured drama. This was my life now. A landscape of quiet evenings punctuated by the glow of screens. I picked up my phone, my thumb swiping aimlessly through the usual feeds. Nothing, nothing, nothing. My algorithm eventually served me a travel video. A blonde, perpetually smiling guy in his 20s was wandering through a foreign country. The title read, "Hidden Gems of Bali." "You won't believe this market." I tapped on it. Why not? For a few minutes, I could pretend I was somewhere else, somewhere warm and loud and alive. The vlogger was talking, his voice a little too loud, about the vibrant colors and exotic smells. The camera bobbed and weaved through a dense crowd, past stalls piled high with spices, silks, and strange, spiky fruits. It was chaos. A beautiful, overwhelming chaos that felt a million miles away from my sterile living room. I watched, half mesmerized, my fork hovering over the cold noodles. And then I saw it. It wasn't even a full person at first, just a flicker of movement in the background, behind a stack of woven baskets. A familiar gesture. The way a man I knew used to run his hand through his hair. My heart gave a painful little lurch. "Stop it, Anna," I told myself. "You're seeing ghosts again," but I couldn't let it go. My thumb, shaking slightly, tapped the screen, dragging the little red dot back 10 seconds. I played it again. There. A man in a blue linen shirt turns his head. The vlogger's camera pans past him, but for a split second. A single impossible second. His face was in profile. The breath caught in my throat. I paused the video. The image was blurry, pixelated. It could be anyone. It had to be anyone else. But the set of his shoulders, the curve of his neck. I knew that silhouette better than my own. I pinched the screen, zooming in as far as my phone would allow. The image dissolved into a mess of colored squares, but the shape remained. My hand was trembling now, a tremor that started in my fingers and radiated up my arm. I scrolled forward, frame by frame. The vlogger moved on, talking to a woman selling necklaces. But in the background, the man in the blue shirt was still there. He turned and he laughed. Laughed at something someone off camera said. It was Mark's laugh. A full-throated, head-thrown-back laugh that I hadn't heard in 2 years, but that was seared into my memory. And then the camera panned just slightly to the left. A woman stepped into the frame beside him, her blonde hair catching the tropical sun. She reached up, a bright, easy smile on her face, and kissed his cheek. It was my sister Chloe. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. The sound was deafening in the silent room. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were encased in concrete. It wasn't possible. Mark was dead. Chloe was at a wellness retreat in Arizona. My mind was screaming these facts, but my eyes had seen the truth. Alive. Laughing. Tanned and healthy and so alive. On the floor, the video played on, oblivious. The vlogger's cheerful voice filled the room, a grotesque soundtrack to my world collapsing. "And this," he said brightly, holding a piece of fruit up to the camera, "is a mangosteen. Let's give it a try." The upbeat ukulele music swelled as he took a bite, his face lighting up with delight. The cheerful tune was the cruelest sound I had ever heard. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. And only one person could give it to me. My fingers felt like clumsy, frozen sausages as I fumbled to pick up my phone from the floor. My whole body was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that made my teeth chatter. "It's a mistake," my brain kept repeating, a desperate, broken mantra. A cruel coincidence. A deepfake video. Anything but the truth. Because the truth was impossible. It would mean that my marriage, my grief, my sister, that my entire life for the past 2 years, and maybe even the 15 years before that, had been a lie. And I couldn't accept that. Not yet. My thumb hovered over Chloe's contact photo, a picture of us from last Christmas, both wearing stupid reindeer antlers, her arm slung around my shoulders in a gesture of protection. I had to call her. She would explain it. She would laugh and tell me how silly I was being, and the world would click back into place. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pressed the call button. I had to sound calm. If I sounded crazy, she would just dismiss it as grief. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, she picked up. "Hey, sweetie. Everything okay?" Her voice was a little too bright, a little too loud, like she was performing happiness for someone else in the room. "Chloe." "Hi," I managed, my voice tight. I just wanted to check in. How's the retreat?" "Oh, it's amazing," she chirped. "So rejuvenating. We just finished a sunrise yoga session. The reception is terrible out here in the desert, though. You're kind of breaking up." I could hear a faint, staticky crackle on the line, a sound that felt artificial. "Right?" "Arizona," I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I closed my eyes, the image from the video burning behind my eyelids, the vibrant green of the jungle, the humidity that seemed to steam off the pavement. "Chloe, I saw something strange. A video online." I tried to keep my voice even conversational. It was a travel blog. From Bali. The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It stretched for an eternity. 1 second, 2, 5. A black hole of a silence that sucked all the air from my lungs and all the hope from my heart. In that silence, I knew. The sick, terrifying truth settled in my bones before she even spoke another word. When she finally did, her voice was a high-pitched, frantic squeak. Bali? Oh my god, that's so weird. I think my friend was there last month. Maybe she posted an old video. Or, everyone has a doppelganger. People tell me all the time I look like that actress. What's her name? The lies came out in a torrent, clumsy and desperate, tripping over each other. And Mark? A guy who looks like Mark? Anna, honey, you know how common his face is. A handsome guy in a blue shirt? That could be anyone. She was rambling, her words slurring together in a panic. It's probably just some cruel prank. You know how sick people are online. They probably use that AI face-swapping thing to mess with you. You need to stop watching those things, sweetie. It's not healthy for you. I didn't say anything. I just listened to her spin and squirm, each pathetic lie another nail in the coffin of the sister I thought I had. The woman who held me on the beach. The woman who told me Mark adored me. I pressed the red icon on my screen, and the sound of her frantic voice was cut off. The silence that followed the click of the phone was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a cold, clear purpose, and I knew exactly where I had to start. The anger came after the numbness. It was a cold, quiet fury that settled deep in my bones, a stark contrast to the chaotic, messy grief I had lived with for 2 years. For the first time since Mark's death, my mind felt sharp, clear. All the passive sadness, the conflict avoidance that had defined my widowhood, it all burned away, leaving behind a single, terrifying thought. I have been a fool. My feet carried me down the hall to Mark's home office. The door had been closed for 730 days. Chloe had insisted. It's too painful, Anna. Let's just leave it for a while. And I had listened, because listening was easier than feeling. I had allowed this room, my husband's room, to become a sealed tomb. Now I realized it wasn't a tomb. It was a crime scene. The door opened with a soft groan, releasing the scent of stale air and old paper. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. A half-empty coffee mug on the desk, a stack of financial journals, his favorite pen lying at an angle. But my eyes were drawn to the sleek, black filing cabinet in the corner. The one Chloe told me held all of his sensitive work files that were now being handled by the estate. The one she had the only key for, or so she thought. I went to the kitchen and returned with a screwdriver from the junk drawer. My hands were steady as I jammed the tip into the lock. It took a few tries, the metal scraping and groaning in protest before I heard a satisfying click. The drawer slid open silently. The first thing I saw was a mountain of confetti. Thousands of thin, shredded strips of paper filled the entire top drawer. My heart sank, of course. They wouldn't be that careless. But as I ran my fingers through the paper ribbons, I realized they were all from the same type of document. Thick, watermarked paper. Financial statements. I dumped the entire contents onto Mark's expansive mahogany desk. For the next 4 hours, fueled by that cold, burning anger, I worked. I was a detective, an archaeologist of my own ruined life, painstakingly piecing together a puzzle of deceit. Slowly, words and numbers began to emerge from the chaos. Offshore holdings, Cayman Islands, sovereign trust, names of shell corporations that meant nothing to me. Then I found it. A semi-intact statement from his personal portfolio. And a date. 1 week before the sailing accident, he had liquidated everything. Every stock, every bond, every mutual fund. A lifetime of investments. Turned into cash. Gone. My breath hitched. I pushed on, my fingers sticky from the tape I was using to piece together a different document. An insurance application. A new life insurance policy for $5 million, taken out just 6 months before he died. 6 months. Long enough for it to seem legitimate. Short enough to be convenient. The final piece of the puzzle lay at the very bottom of the drawer, a single contract that had somehow survived the shredder almost completely intact. It was a consulting agreement between one of the shell corporations and an independent contractor. I scanned the dense legal text, my eyes searching for a name, any name. And then I saw it at the bottom of the last page, a looping, familiar signature, that I had seen on every birthday card of my life. Chloe Marie Jensen. The document detailed a one-time payment of $250,000 for market analysis. The date on the check corresponded with the week after, Mark's memorial service. I stared at her name, at the graceful, feminine curve of the C and the cheerful loop of the E. My sister's signature. The proof of her betrayal wasn't in a secret video from halfway around the world. It was right here, in my husband's office, in black and white. It hit me then. A truth so staggering it left me breathless. This wasn't an affair that ended in a tragic escape. This was a heist. A long, meticulously planned, brilliantly executed heist. They didn't just run away together. They cashed out, faked a death, collected the insurance, and left me to grieve in the empty shell of a life they had robbed. And my own sister, my rock, my hero, had been holding the getaway car keys the entire time. I sat there, in the dark of my dead husband's office, surrounded by the shredded evidence of my life, and I knew this was just the beginning. I had to know how deep the rot went, and who else in my family knew I was the last to find out. The drive to my parents' house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I clutched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, a single, grainy photograph printed on cheap office paper lying on the passenger seat. It felt like a bomb. With every red light, every turn onto a familiar street, a part of me, the naive, conflict-avoidant part that had been running my life for 2 years, screamed at me to turn back. To go home, delete the video, and pretend I'd never seen it. But the cold, hard anger that had taken root in my chest wouldn't let me. I had to know. I pulled into the driveway of the house I grew up in. The rose bushes my mother fussed over were in full bloom. The paint on the porch was a cheerful, welcoming white. It looked like a perfect family home, a fortress of normalcy. I took a deep breath, grabbed the photograph, and walked up the steps. They were in the living room, my father reading the newspaper in his favorite armchair, my mother arranging flowers in a vase on the coffee table. The air smelled of lemon polish and fresh-cut lilies. The scene was so painfully, deceptively normal it felt like a slap in the face. "Anna! What a nice surprise," my mother said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I was just about to call you." I didn't smile back. I walked over to the coffee table and placed the photograph face up, right next to her vase of lilies. "I need you to explain this," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. My father lowered his newspaper. My mother glanced down. I watched her face as she processed the image, the blurry figures, the market background, the unmistakable faces of her 2 daughters' husbands. Or one current husband and one supposedly dead one. She looked away instantly, her hand flying to the pearl necklace she always wore. "Oh, honey," she began, her voice dripping with a cloying sympathy that made my skin crawl. "What is this? Some silly internet thing? You know you can't trust what you see online." "Look at it, Mom," I insisted, my voice harder now. "No," she said, physically turning her body away from the photo. "I don't need to. Anna, you've been through so much. Grief does strange things to a person's mind. It makes you see things that aren't there." My father folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness and stood up. He picked up the photograph, his eyes scanning it for a long, heavy moment. He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the wall just over my shoulder. "Anna," he said, his voice a low, placating rumble. "What's the point of this? Digging all this up? It's not going to bring Mark back. It's just going to cause pain." He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading. "You need to think about the family. You need to think of Chloe's reputation." And that's when I saw it. It wasn't in their words. It was in the flicker of panic in my father's eyes. In the way my mother was twisting her necklace, her knuckles white. In the way neither of them asked the most obvious question, "Who is that man?" They weren't surprised. They weren't shocked or horrified. They were scared. Scared that a secret they had been keeping was finally coming to light. The room started to feel small, the air thick and unbreathable. They knew. Maybe they didn't know everything, but they knew something. And they had chosen to protect Chloe, to preserve the family's placid, perfect facade over telling me the truth. "So you want me to just let it go?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My mother finally turned back to me, her face a mask of concern. "I think," she said softly, "that you need to talk to someone, dear, professionally. Dr. Evans was so helpful after the accident. Maybe it's time for you to make another appointment to help you process these delusions. The word hung in the air between us. Delusions. That was it. The final, ultimate betrayal. They weren't just complicit in the lie. They were actively trying to write me into it as the crazy one, the broken widow who couldn't accept reality. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The cold anger inside me solidified into something that felt like ice. I looked from my mother's fake pitying face to my father's cowardly, averted gaze. And I understood. I was completely, utterly alone. I turned and walked out of the house, leaving the photograph on the table among the lilies. I realized then that the only truth I could rely on was the one I found myself, buried in the past. After the confrontation with my parents, the world felt tilted. The familiar ground beneath my feet was gone, replaced by a dizzying, unstable void. They had chosen a lie over their own daughter. Their love, which I had thought was a foundational truth of my life, was conditional. It was a prop to be used in the stage play of their perfect family, and I had been cast as the disposable, tragic character. I drove home in a daze, the ice in my veins slowly melting into a deep, aching loneliness. I needed an anchor, something real from a time before the lies, a time when a family photo wasn't a carefully constructed piece of propaganda. I found myself pulling down the rickety ladder to the attic. The smell of old wood and mothballs, a scent from a forgotten childhood. Shafts of dusty sunlight cut through the gloom, illuminating forgotten treasures and mountains of junk. I navigated past my old bicycle, a box of my father's college textbooks, and finally found what I was looking for, a stack of photo albums and old storage boxes. I just wanted to see a picture of myself as a kid, a real smile on my face, before my world had been hollowed out. Tucked behind a box of Christmas decorations was a smaller, painted wooden chest I didn't recognize at first. It had faded pink roses on the lid and a small brass latch. Scrawled on a piece of masking tape on the side was one word, Chloe's. It was her old memory box from high school. She must have left it here years ago. I felt a pang of something. Nostalgia, maybe? For the sister I thought I had. Curiosity got the better of me. I unlatched it. Inside was a jumble of teenage girlhood. A dried corsage, a ticket stub from a concert we went to together, a friendship bracelet I'd made for her. It all felt so innocent, so painfully normal. But as I lifted a stack of old report cards, my fingers brushed against a seam in the velvet lining at the bottom. The lining was loose. I pulled at it, and a section of the floor of the box lifted up, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in the dusty silence. Inside the compartment were two things. A pair of tiny plastic bracelets from a hospital, the kind they put on newborns, and a folded, official-looking document. My hands trembled as I picked up the hospital bracelets. The typed name on one read, Baby Boy Jensen. The second one read, Chloe Jensen. Then I unfolded the document. It was a birth certificate. The baby's name was listed as Marcus Jensen Peterson, and under the line for the father, a name was typed in neat. Black ink, Markham Mark Peterson. I read the name 3 times, the letters blurring and sharpening in the dim light. Markham, my husband's full legal name. A name he only ever used on official documents. My eyes jumped to the date of birth, October 12th, just 8 months ago, which meant the baby was conceived in January of last year. The same month Mark and I had taken that trip to Vermont for our anniversary. The same week we'd talked about trying for a baby of our own, a conversation that had left me feeling so full of hope. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Chloe, sitting on my couch, her face streaked with tears. My parents on either side of her, their faces etched with concern. It was a few months after Mark's accident. I've made a decision, she'd sobbed. I'm going to adopt. I know it's crazy to do it alone, but I feel this calling to be a mother. We had all rushed to comfort her. My parents praised her courage, her selflessness, and I had hugged her, promising to be the best auntie in the world, so grateful to have a baby in the family, a little piece of light to chase away the darkness of my grief. It was all a performance, a sick, twisted theatrical masterpiece. They didn't just steal my money and my husband. They stole my grief and used it as a cover story. They built a new family, his family, with his son, right in front of me, on the very ashes of the life they had torched. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a replacement. I was no longer the grieving widow. I was obsolete. The first draft of a life they had decided to rewrite. I sank to the dusty floor of the attic, the birth certificate clutched in my hand, and for the first time I didn't cry. The woman who cried was gone, and in her place was someone they had created, a woman with nothing left to lose and an entire world to burn down. The time for passive acceptance was over. Now I had to start unraveling everything. The naive woman I had been, the one who avoided conflict and trusted her family implicitly, died in that dusty attic. She didn't fade away. She was murdered by the cold, hard truth of that birth certificate. The woman who walked down the attic ladder was someone new. Someone colder. Someone who understood that justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you took. The next morning, I didn't call my parents to scream or my friends to cry. I made 2 appointments. The first was with a man named Frank Miller, a private investigator whose office was in a rundown building downtown that smelled of stale coffee and regret. He was a cliché, grizzled, wearing a rumpled trench coat with eyes that had seen too much. He listened to my story without a flicker of surprise, just a slight narrowing of his gaze as I laid out the details. I was no longer the timid widow. I was a client with a clear objective. "So, to be clear, ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "you believe your deceased husband is alive, living in Bali with your sister, and they've stolen a significant amount of money from you." "I don't believe it," I corrected him, my voice flat and steady. "I know it. I have video and I have this." I slid a high-quality copy of the birth certificate across his cluttered desk. He picked it up, studied it, and a low whistle escaped his lips. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Okay, kid. I'm in." My second appointment was with a forensic accountant named Evelyn Reed. Her office was the polar opposite of Frank's, a sterile, glass-and-steel tower with panoramic city views. She was sharp, precise, and exuded an aura of intimidating competence. As I walked her through the shredded documents I'd pieced together and the shell corporations I'd identified, her expression went from professional curiosity to something that looked almost like predatory glee. "This is sloppy," she said, pointing to a transfer of funds. "Amateur hour." They got cocky. They thought no one would ever look. For the next 2 weeks, I operated with a singular, chilling focus. Frank and Evelyn became my entire world. The updates came in fast and furious, each one a fresh layer of filth on a wound I thought couldn't get any deeper. Frank was brutally efficient. Within 48 hours, he had confirmation. "They're not even trying to hide," he said over the phone. "Bought a beachfront villa just outside of Ubud, paid in cash. New names are James and Sarah Peterson. Real original." Meanwhile, Evelyn was a bloodhound on a scent. She unraveled their financial web with a speed that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "It's bigger than you thought," she told me during one of our daily calls, her voice buzzing with energy. "He didn't just drain your joint accounts. He systematically embezzled from his clients for years. We're not talking about a couple $100,000. We're looking at close to $10 million. $10 million. An amount so vast I couldn't even comprehend it. It was a number that represented years of lies, of calculated smiles and feigned affection, all while he was methodically gutting our life and the lives of people who trusted him. The final blow came on a Tuesday afternoon. An email from Frank with a single attachment and no subject line. My hand trembled as I clicked it open. It was a photograph. Recent. Crystal clear. Mark and Chloe were on a pristine white sand beach, the turquoise water of the Indian Ocean sparkling behind them. They were laughing. Mark had his arm around Chloe and she was holding a baby, their son, Marcus. The baby was wearing a tiny sun hat and clapping his hands. They looked like a perfect family on a perfect vacation. A postcard from the life they had stolen from me, paid for with my money, built on the foundation of my public grief. I stared at the image for a long, long time. The faces of the 3 people who had destroyed me, smiling, happy, without a care in the world. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. The last vestiges of the old Anna, the hurt, the sadness, the confusion, were burned away by a white-hot, clarifying rage. This was no longer about understanding why. It was no longer about getting my money back. It was about retribution. They had built their paradise on my personal hell, and I was going to burn it to the ground. Evelyn had already mentioned a name, an old business partner Mark had supposedly screwed over years ago. A man who might know where the real skeletons were buried. Evelyn Reed. My forensic accountant had a look of predatory glee in her eyes when she gave me the name. David Chen, she'd said. He was Mark's original partner. Mark forced him out with a hostile buyout about 5 years ago. Rumor was it was dirty. David's been running a small independent consultancy ever since. If anyone knows where Mark buried the bodies, financially speaking, it's him. Finding an ally felt like a dangerous, desperate move, but I was long past caution. I met David in a worn-down diner on the edge of the financial district, a place with cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of burnt coffee. He was older than I expected, with tired eyes and a handshake that was firm but reluctant. He looked at me, the supposed grieving widow of his old nemesis, with an expression of deep, undisguised skepticism. "Thanks for meeting me," I began, my voice sounding small in the clatter of the diner. "Your accountant was very persuasive," he said, not unkindly. He took a sip of his black coffee. "Look, I'll be honest. I don't know what you want from me. What happened with Mark? That was a long time ago. I've moved on." I could see he was lying. The bitterness was still there, a shadow in his eyes. The old Anna would have tried to appeal to his sympathy, would have stumbled over her words. But the new me, she was all business. I opened the file folder I'd brought and slid the first document across the table. It was the screenshot from the Bali video. "Mark's not dead, David." He stared at the picture, his expression unreadable. He didn't look shocked, just weary, like he'd always known Mark was the kind of man who could pull a rabbit out of a hat, even if the rabbit was himself, and the hat was a grave. Next, I showed him the copy of the birth certificate. I watched his eyes scan the names. Markham Peterson, Chloe Jensen. He looked up at me then, and the skepticism in his eyes was finally replaced by a flicker of something else. Pity, maybe. "Your sister?" he asked, his voice low. I just nodded, pushing the final documents toward him. The summary of the $10 million fraud Evelyn had uncovered. He read through the pages slowly, his jaw tightening. "That son of a bitch," he finally whispered, pushing the papers back toward me. He leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms. He used the same playbook on me. Smaller scale, obviously. A few falsified invoices, a cooked ledger, enough to make it look like I was skimming. By the time I proved my innocence, he'd already forced me to sell my shares for pennies on the dollar to avoid a scandal. A shared history of betrayal hung in the air between us. He finally understood. "I can't help you get your money back from Bali," he said, his voice laced with regret. "But..." He paused, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto mine with a new intensity. Mark was always arrogant. He always had to have one big, untouchable piggy bank. A master account where he funneled the real money, the untraceable stuff. He once bragged about a bank in Macau. No extradition treaty. He'd think it was the safest place in the world. The missing piece, the key. Evelyn had found dozens of accounts, but they were all feeders, designed to be discovered eventually. The master account, that was the heart of the entire operation. "He believes he's untouchable," I said, the words tasting like metal. David nodded slowly. "And people like that? They have to be taught a lesson." An unspoken agreement passed between us. This wasn't just my fight anymore. My desire for retribution was now mirrored in the eyes of the man sitting across from me. His own long-simmering need for justice had just been given a new, powerful focus. He extended his hand across the table. "Mark ruined my career," he said, his voice hard as steel. "Your sister and your family betrayed you. Let's make them regret it." I shook his hand. It was a firm, solid grip. The promise of an alliance. We weren't just two victims anymore. We were partners. And we spent the next week building the perfect trap. Evelyn's sleek, impersonal conference room became our war room. The glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the city felt like the command deck of a starship, a place far removed from the messy, emotional chaos that had defined my life. For 2 weeks, the four of us, me, David, Frank, and Evelyn, huddled over laptops and whiteboards, fueled by coffee and a shared, cold fury. We were a strange, broken little team, united by one man's treachery. David, with his intimate knowledge of the company's inner workings, was our strategist. He still had contacts, old loyalists who had been pushed aside by Mark's regime of sycophants. He spent days on the phone, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur, planting seeds of doubt, hinting at financial irregularities, and turning Mark's greedy cronies against each other. "They're rats in a barrel," he'd say, a grim smile on his face after a particularly fruitful call. All we need to do is convince them the ship is sinking. My role was the most surreal. I was the ghost. I had to leverage the very identity Mark had tried to destroy. As his grieving widow and the primary beneficiary of his estate, I still held a surprising amount of legal power. On the advice of a shark of a lawyer Evelyn had hired, I drafted a letter. It was polite, formal, and utterly devastating. It invoked a little-known clause in the company's charter that allowed a majority shareholder or their heir to call an emergency meeting to address matters of grave financial misconduct. They'll fight it, David warned. Let them, I said, my voice feeling like it belonged to someone else, someone far stronger than I ever thought I could be. It will only make them look more guilty. While David sowed chaos and I played the part of the avenging ghost, Evelyn worked with international banking contacts to prepare the final fatal blow. A complex, multi-layered injunction that, once triggered, would simultaneously freeze every known account tied to Mark, Chloe, and their shell corporations across 7 different countries. When we pull the trigger, she explained, pointing to a dizzying flowchart on the whiteboard, he won't have enough money to buy a cup of coffee. His new identity, his villa, his entire fabricated life, it will all be worthless paper. The night before the final plan was set in motion, I stood in front of the mirror in my silent, empty house and practiced the speech I would deliver to the board via video conference. I looked at my reflection, the dark circles under my eyes, the new, hard set of my jaw. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. My name is Anna Peterson, I said to the mirror, my voice steady, betraying none of the terror and rage that was churning inside me. And for the past 2 years, you have been complicit in a lie that has not only defrauded this company's clients and shareholders, but has also served as a cover for a crime of profound personal betrayal. I took a deep breath. I could do this. The naive, trusting woman who let others make her decisions was gone. The conflict-avoidant wife was gone. All that was left was this cold, clear purpose. The next morning, I packed a single carry-on bag. Just the essentials. My laptop, a burner phone, and a change of clothes. Frank had booked me a one-way ticket to Bali under a new name. It was time. As the plane lifted off the runway, breaking through the gray, overcast clouds into the brilliant, unending sunshine above, I felt a strange sense of calm. For 2 years, I had been trapped in the past, a prisoner of grief and lies. Now, hurtling through the sky at 500 miles per hour, I wasn't running away from anything. I was the hunter. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I was flying toward the light. I knew that the moment I landed, I would be walking directly into the heart of the storm, ready to finally confront them. The taxi dropped me at the end of a long, winding driveway flanked by lush, overflowing bougainvillea. The air was thick with the scent of salt and frangipani, and the humid heat was a physical presence wrapping around me like a blanket. At the end of the drive, I could see it. A sprawling white villa with an infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the turquoise ocean. It was a paradise built on my tears. I walked up the stone path, my heart a cold, steady drum in my chest. I didn't knock. The large glass doors were slid open to welcome the ocean breeze. I stepped inside. They were on the veranda laughing. Chloe was lounging on a rattan sofa, holding a sleeping baby in her arms. Mark was standing at the edge of the pool, a drink in his hand, telling some story that had her captivated. They looked happy, carefree, utterly despicably content. "Hello, Mark," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the sound of the surf like a shard of glass. Mark froze, his back to me. Chloe's head snapped up, her laughing smile dissolving into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. And in a way, she had. Mark turned around slowly, his face draining of all color. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the terracotta tiles. For a moment, no one spoke. We were 3 figures in a silent, terrible tableau. "Anna," he finally breathed, the name a ragged whisper. "It's a beautiful home," I said, my voice unnervingly calm as I walked toward them. "You must be very proud. $10 million buys a lot of paradise, doesn't it?" Chloe started to cry, silent tears tracking through her perfect sun-kissed makeup as she clutched the baby tighter. "Anna, I can explain—" "Can you?" I asked, stopping a few feet from her. "Can you explain the shell corporations? The offshore accounts? The life insurance policy you helped me cash in while you were planning your escape? I turned my gaze to Mark, who was now staring at me with a mixture of terror and rising anger. Can you explain your son, Marcus? You always did like that name. The last of his shock burned away, replaced by a familiar, arrogant bluster. It was the face of a cornered rat. You have no idea what you're talking about, he snarled, taking a step toward me. You shouldn't have come here. You're going to regret this. No, I said, not flinching. You are. Right on cue, his phone buzzed on the table beside Chloe. A frantic, insistent ringing that wouldn't stop. He ignored it. You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life? He spat, his voice rising. I built this. I earned this. You stole it, I said calmly. And right about now, David Chen is presenting your entire criminal enterprise to the board of directors. I imagine it's not going well for you. The phone kept ringing. Finally, with a curse, he snatched it up. What? He barked into the receiver. I watched his face as he listened. I saw the arrogant confidence crumble, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. The blood drained from his face, leaving a pasty gray pallor beneath his tan. His knuckles were white where he gripped the phone. What do you mean, frozen? He whispered, his voice cracking. All of them? No. No, that's not possible. The Macau account. It's untouchable. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with disbelief and a new, desperate fear. His new identity. His carefully constructed life. It was all gone. He was no longer James Peterson, wealthy expat. He was Mark Peterson, a common thief with a worthless passport. He sank onto the sofa next to Chloe, the phone clattering from his limp hand. He was penniless, trapped. My work here was almost done. I turned my attention to my sister, who was now openly sobbing, rocking the baby in her arms. And you, Chloe, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion at all. You should know that in the eyes of the law, your son, as the illegitimate child of a man who faked his death to commit fraud, is entitled to absolutely nothing. I turned my back on them, on their shattered paradise, on the wreckage of the lives they had so carelessly built on top of mine. As I walked away, I didn't feel triumph, just the quiet finality of a closing door, knowing that their beautiful villa had just become a very different kind of prison. I didn't stay to watch the fallout in Bali. I simply walked out of that white villa, down the bougainvillea-lined driveway, and got into a waiting taxi, never once looking back. The reckoning, as my team and I had called it, was swift and merciless, a perfectly executed demolition. I watched the rest of it unfold from my laptop in a quiet hotel room overlooking the ocean, a world away from their self-made prison. The story broke online within hours. Financial news outlets exploded with headlines about the stunning corporate coup at Mark's old firm. But it was the more sensationalist blogs and news sites that truly captured the public's imagination. Dead CEO found alive in Bali with sister-in-law. One headline screamed. Another read, The Ultimate Betrayal, How a Grieving Widow Uncovered a Multi-million-dollar Lie. My name was everywhere, but my face was not. I remained a ghost, the unseen architect of their destruction. My parents, however, were not so lucky. Frank, my PI, sent me a link to a live press conference. I watched, detached, as my mother and father stood at a podium in front of their perfect, lily-filled home. My mother, her face a puffy mask of practiced sorrow, clutched a tissue and dabbed at her dry eyes. We are utterly devastated, she began, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion, to learn that our daughter, Chloe, was capable of such profound deceit. It has shattered our family. My father, looking gray and diminished, stepped forward. We had no knowledge of Chloe and Mark's actions, he lied, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. We offer our deepest sympathies to Anna, and we want to state publicly that we are severing all ties with our daughter. She is no longer a part of this family. It was a masterful performance in self-preservation. They threw Chloe under the bus to save their own social standing, erasing her from the family portrait as easily as they had tried to erase my sanity. Frank's next update included a photo from an Indonesian news source. Mark and Chloe, stripped of their resort wear, were now in a grimy, overcrowded detention center. The photo was blurry, taken through a barred window, but their expressions were clear. They were sitting on opposite sides of a concrete bench, not speaking, not looking at each other. Chloe was weeping, her face buried in her hands. Mark was just staring at the wall, a look of hollow disbelief on his face. The great love story, the grand escape they had sacrificed everything for. It had dissolved in an instant, revealing the ugly transactional truth underneath. Their love wasn't real. It was a business partnership that had just gone bankrupt. When I finally returned to the US a week later, the first thing I did was call a locksmith. I stood on my front porch and watched as he methodically replaced every lock on every door. The satisfying click of the new deadbolt sliding into place was the first real sound of freedom. Then I began the purge. I walked through the silent, perfect house and systematically erased them. Every photograph of Mark went into a black trash bag. Every gift he'd ever given me. Every piece of clothing of his that still hung in the closet. Then I moved on to Chloe. The little trinkets she'd brought me, the books she'd recommended, the framed photo of the two of us as children that had sat on my bedside table for 20 years. It all went into the bag. I was not sad. I was not angry. I felt nothing. I was an archaeologist cleaning a dig site, carefully removing the contaminated artifacts to get to the clean, untouched layers beneath. By the time I was done, the house was stark, almost empty. The walls were bare, the shelves half full. It was no longer a mausoleum for a dead marriage. It was just an empty house. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I could finally breathe in it, even if the air still tasted of ash. The next step was to rebuild. Not just a company, but a life. 6 months can feel like a lifetime. Or, in my case, like the beginning of one. The boardroom on the 42nd floor is all glass and light, overlooking a city that now feels like my own. David sits to my right, a quiet, steady presence. The rest of my executive team, hand-picked, loyal, brilliant, watch me, waiting for my final word on the quarterly projections. The woman I was 2 years ago, the one who couldn't even bring herself to look at a bank statement, would never recognize the person sitting at the head of this table. I make a decision, my voice clear and confident, and the team nods in agreement. There are no sycophants here, just respect. This is what it feels like to build something real. The house, the one that had been my perfect, silent mausoleum, is gone. I sold it to a young family with 2 loud, laughing children. I hope they fill its quiet spaces with joy. I moved into a downtown apartment with a small balcony and a view of the city lights. It's smaller, but it's mine. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf was chosen by me, for me. It's a space that looks toward the future, not the past. My life has sound in it again. Last Sunday, I hosted a brunch. It wasn't for family, not the one I was born into anyway. It was for the family I had chosen. David and his wife were there. Evelyn, my brilliant, terrifying accountant. A few friends from a pottery class I'd started taking. The apartment was filled with the clatter of plates and the easy, genuine sound of laughter. For a moment, I just stood in the kitchen, listening, and a real, unforced smile spread across my face. I was happy. It was a feeling so unfamiliar I almost didn't recognize it. Yesterday, a letter arrived. It had been forwarded through my lawyer's office, the envelope a cheap, flimsy thing. There was no return address, but I knew the looping, feminine handwriting instantly. It was from Chloe. I opened it, my hands surprisingly steady. The letter was short, written on a single sheet of ruled paper, the ink smudged in places as if by tears. She was back in the States awaiting trial. Mark had taken a plea deal that implicated her in everything. She wrote that she was terrified, that she was sorry, but the apology was buried under paragraphs of self-pity. She ended by begging me for help. Not for herself, but for Marcus. He was in foster care, and she was desperate. "He is your blood, Anna. He's all I have left, please. Don't let him pay for our mistakes." The old me, the woman who avoided conflict at all costs, would have been torn apart by this. The guilt would have eaten her alive. She would have felt the crushing weight of responsibility for a child who was the living symbol of her own destruction. But I am not that woman anymore. I walked over to the fireplace in my new living room. I read the letter one last time, acknowledging the faint echo of a pain that once would have crippled me. Then I touched the corner of the page to the flame. I watched as my sister's desperate, manipulative words turned to black, curling ash. My responsibility was not to the wreckage they had left behind. My responsibility was to the woman I had fought so hard to become. This morning, I woke before dawn. I made a cup of coffee and stepped out onto my balcony. The city was still asleep, a sprawling galaxy of soft, distant lights. The air was cool and clean. I leaned against the railing, the warm mug in my hands, and I watched as the first pale fingers of light began to stretch across the eastern sky. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I am scarred, but I am not broken. The sun rose, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, promising a new day. A new beginning. I took a sip of my coffee, the bitter warmth a welcome shock to my senses, and I smiled.
My next chapter was waiting.